flow was like prior to COVID, but it changed with this story. When it came to this story, I never had more hands in the vetting of this story. While it was cleared by the Manitoba managing exec and the director, a local web writer flagged it. And she said, maybe we should get a response from Pfizer. I says, no, I think we've heard more than enough from Pfizer. Then she said, I don't think the vaccine is still in the trial phase. And I produced a document saying it is until 2023. But she sent out an internal email to several people in the newsroom, and she decided that my story should be forwarded to the Toronto Health Unit. Now, this is a special unit within the CBC, and she wanted them to do a final vet of my story. So now the CBC Toronto Health Unit was in charge of my story. It was the end of June, and I was really getting anxious over how long this was taking because, as I mentioned before, I was used to turning stories around in a day or two, but to me it was critical timing because the rollout was ramping up for the vaccination of young people in Manitoba. It was in full swing. Finally, 5 weeks later, on July 8th...
5 weeks?
5 weeks. Remember, I could turn around stories in 2 or 3 days. This was 5 weeks. So I think it was they were sitting on the story. Maybe they were just hoping that I would go away and not persist in doing this story. But 5 weeks after, July 8th, I pitched the story. I was called into a meeting. Well, this was on Zoom because we were all working from home by then. And that they had a verdict from Toronto. And, I should mention to you that over 3 decades at the CBC, I'd say 30 to 35% of the stories I did were health stories. Never had I had a story that had to go to the Toronto Health Unit, and never was a story given this level of scrutiny.
So I just want to emphasize this because you had told us earlier that, basically things changed at COVID. So what you're saying is for your 35 years as a journalist, like 35 to 40% of your stories were health stories. So it was, you knew what you could run, what it took to run a health story, and that never before had it been sent to, this Toronto Health Unit, or no story in your career had ever been put under this much scrutiny.
Never. Like I had mentioned, it was one producer, and the story was put through and it was published. And all of a sudden now, there were all these hands in the story. And what I want to mention to you, which is key to know here, is that before I tell you what happened, that none of the facts, none of the data, none of the research, nothing I put forward in that story in terms of any of the information was contested. It was rock-solid journalism, and I knew that I could put my name to that and defend every word I had written. They raised 2 concerns that was an issue for them. Did I know that the Alliance promoted ivermectin? And did I know that some of the members of the Alliance chose to be anonymous? Those were their 2 concerns. So my thought was, okay, now the story is being blocked further up the chain. I did know they supported ivermectin, but that was not the focus of the piece. And I had been sending for weeks links to management from medical journals about the success of ivermectin in treating COVID. I got no response. I said we should be having a debate about ivermectin on air and hear from experts who support its use. But that was not the focus of this piece. As for members being anonymous, I was confused by that because I thought, I interviewed Stephen Pellick. He went full face on camera with his credentials, so there was no anonymity there. And I could only guess that maybe some were choosing to be anonymous because they wanted to be able to continue to practice without fear of being disciplined anyway. But what came next left me just speechless. I was just astonished. They said, well, there's a story to be told about the parents' concerns. The Canadian COVID Care Alliance was problematic. I should drop them out of the story, keep the parents' concerns in, but interview 2 experts that CBC Toronto was recommending. And of course, I did my research. Well, who are these people? Well, one of them was a pediatric immunologist who told me both of her kids were vaccinated. She had worked with the federal government. She chaired a national committee overseeing the approval process of COVID-19 vaccines in Canada. I was being told to drop Pellick out of the story, who was raising flags about safety concerns, and put this woman in. I was just stunned. I was shocked. I could not believe that they were asking me to do this. I said, this is unethical. This is immoral. You're violating all our principles of fairness and balance and accuracy and being impartial and acting with integrity. And I says, what you're asking me to do is dishonest and it's manipulative. The parents I had on tape, I'd interviewed, they were backing the science of bridal. And to include them in the story but leave the alliance out, to me, defied logic. It didn't make any sense. We were effectively censoring people in the scientific community with impeccable credentials because they just didn't fall in line with the narrative. I said to the managing editor, I'm standing down. I'm walking away from this story. I'm not going to do what you're asking me to do. I've invested too much in this. I'm not going to sell these people out. And why should I have to include two doctors that Toronto has picked out? And then I think, like, what if this story had made it through and it went national? Wouldn't that have changed the narrative across the country? If parents had been armed with this information, would we have seen fewer vaccine injuries?
Can I just stop you? Because another thing just kind of occurred to me when you were sharing that story, and you mentioned how they were actually critical of the CCCA. And I'm thinking, well, just wait, so people that don't know the term, so that stands for the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. And my understanding is, I mean, if it's not hundreds, it's thousands of scientists and doctors. Like, we're talking very credentialed people that have formed an organization to basically look into COVID issues objectively and to provide fair and balanced information. And, if that leads them in a direction that goes against the government narrative, but isn't the fact that that group formed and exists itself a story that should be covered? Like, let alone cutting them out of a story, I was just thinking that in itself is somewhat fantastic and likely would be a story.
And they formed specifically because of COVID and to give an alternative perspective. And I had pitched, let's do a story on them, but it was like, they weren't interested in it. They weren't interested in hearing what these people have to say because they figured they supported ivermectin, so they didn't want to do any of those stories.
And just to give perspective, because I know when we had a conversation, and likely you'll get to it, that you like a reporter will go to a demonstration on an issue where there's like 12 people and report a story, but like when tens of thousands of people don't or show up for a demonstration, it might not be covered if it's going against the government narrative now. So just kind of along those veins, like just even the size of the CCCA itself is quite...
The numbers.
Yeah,
and
quite something.
The fact that they had filed this national petition to me was huge. They were saying, no, we need to stop. We need to pause. We need more information before we roll this out across the country for young people. And that story was shut down.
And that was a petition backed by scientists and medical doctors, citing peer-reviewed evidence.
Correct.
Okay.
So the day that happened to me, which was July 8th, it's burned in my memory because for me that was part of me died that day with that story. And that was the death of journalism for me, July 8th, 2021. Instead, we were clearly pushing propaganda. So I had to call back everyone, and I thought, how am I going to handle this? So I apologized, and I told them the truth, and it was shameful, and it was humiliating, because these people had put themselves on the line to tell me their story. And I said, this is why I can't do it, this is why I won't do it, and it wouldn't see the light of day. And I said, I'm sorry that I have failed you, and I have let you down. I didn't go to work the next day, because I thought, I have to strategize. How am I going to deal with this? Do I quit right now? Do I stay and try to push stories through even harder? The following day, I asked for a conference call with the managing editor, the exec, and the witness. And I said, here's the deal. I says, you know that story was solid journalism. I'm asking you to publish it. You have that power. And I said the timing was key as the province was ramping up the vaccinations of young people. It was urgent that this critical information get out there. And I said, I'm asking you to do this despite what Toronto has said. And if they wouldn't, I could no longer continue to work in this environment. They didn't publish it. It was also at that time I decided I had to start reaching out to other journalists because I felt like I was just losing my mind. Surely other people were seeing what I was seeing. And I did reach out. I reached out locally to a competing network. I also talked to someone south of the border. Through internal email at CBC, I sent out notes saying, this is what I'm seeing. What are you seeing? And I didn't hear back from anybody. So I thought, I'm going to call the CBC union. I called the CBC union, and they said, oh, yeah, we're getting all kinds of calls about people concerned about our bias reporting. And I said, well, where are they? Put me in touch with them. And she said, oh, no, they're not. It's staying with the union. They're not going to go past the union. I says, what does that mean? And she says, well, they're not prepared to do what you're doing. They're not prepared to go all up the ladder and call, power to account. So then I reached out to somebody, and I guess, I understand that because I was sort of at the end of my career, but a lot of the journalists that were calling the union were midway in their career, and they were afraid of losing their jobs. I contacted a senior reporter from a competing network, and I said to her, what are you seeing? She says, oh, I'm seeing the same thing. Why has the media become the mouthpiece of public health? Then I managed to contact a reporter who worked for the New York Times who told me what was happening to me was exactly what was happening to him. His stories were being shut down. He was being blocked. As he saw it, we had two options. One of them was quit and be a whistleblower, or just stay and fight it out and keep trying to push those stories through. He also gave me some advice. He said, document everything that's happened to you as you would cover a news story. Who said what, when, who was president, and the date. I was just reeling from all this because I thought, we have betrayed our audience on a massive scale, massive. And even the CBC acknowledged that erosion of trust in a blog that was written by the editor-in-chief, Brodie Fenlon, in March of 2021. 49% of Canadians think journalists are purposely trying to mislead them. About half of the 1,500 people of the Canadians surveyed felt the CBC was more concerned with supporting an ideology or a political position than informing the public, and that the media was not doing well at being objective. How is the CBC going to rebuild trust in journalism? In 2019, it became a member of the Trusted News Initiative, so that brings together news organizations from all over the world and tech platforms to combat coronavirus disinformation, to identify and stop the spread of it, false claims, half-truths, conspiracy theories. Basically a way to filter news through its own filter system. I saw it basically as a mechanism to call people out who disagreed with the narrative and to label them dangerous and extreme. Why do you need a trust filter system if you're consistently telling the truth? Why are tech platforms involved in combating disinformation? And who are these people in this initiative? Are they journalists? Are they scientists? Is artificial intelligence involved? Who is the Trusted News Initiative? This was an effective way to stop the flow of information, to censor one side, skewed reporting, and labeling opposing opinion and thought as disinformation. Sometime after signing on with the Trusted News Initiative, there was a shift in the lens of how we saw news. It was no longer from the bottom up, it was from the top down. Let me give you a specific example of how this played out in the newsroom and another story that I was blocked in doing. I'd gotten a tip about a peaceful protest in Winnipeg about vaccine mandates, and it was in September of 2021. There was about 2,000 people out on the street. We didn't cover it because it was decided at the editorial level these people were spreading disinformation. This was just unbelievable. I was stunned because I had been sent in, to cover stories and do live hits from protests with 12 people present. But we were going to ignore a group this large and not send a camera and find out what these people had to say. I thought not only is the size of the group newsworthy, it was the fact that it was both vaccinated and unvaccinated people were walking together, and they were united in their opposition to vaccine mandates. I'd gotten a call from someone on the protest line who says, "Where's the CBC? There's people here that are cutting up their vaccine passports as a show of solidarity against the mandates." And I thought, wow, this is a great story. This is great visuals. This is a powerful story of people at the grassroots uniting. Why wasn't the CBC there? It was a decision made at the top level that rather than looking at the news that was unfolding on the ground. When I asked why we weren't there, I didn't get an answer. It wasn't worthy of covering because in the CBC's eyes, these people were disseminating disinformation. How could we say that if we never even spoke to any of them? We ran a few lines of copy that day saying more than 250 people in Winnipeg held a protest against mandates. That was misleading, and it was a half-truth. There was at least 2,000 people. By saying more than 250, we were trying to minimize, in fact, how large it was. And to me, we missed the story entirely, which was people uniting against a cause. Right? Instead, that day, I was assigned a story about a cricket infestation. No one was sent to cover the protest, and the cricket story went national. But there was nothing about the Manitoba protest.
So, Marianne, just so that we have contrast, because you've told us about, listen, there's this protest, 2,000 people. The real story is that both sides are coming together, that people with the passport are so concerned about the mandate, they're cutting that up. So tell us about the exciting cricket story that became national news in Canada. What was the story, just so we're not left in suspense?
That people's back lanes and garages and houses are being filled with crickets. And I'm thinking, really, we're going to tell that story and we're going to basically ignore 2,000 people walking through the city, uniting in a cause. We are just going to ignore these people. To me, that was just unconscionable.
And was the cricket story urgent?
No, I don't. Well, I guess if you were living in a house full of crickets, it might be, but that was not the story to be told that day, but that was the story they decided should be told that day. Later that month, I pitched another story that was shut down.
Stop, and I'm sorry, okay. I can't resist. So we have literally vaccinated people and non-vaccinated people coming together against the mandate, and we have crickets from the CBC. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.
It's shameful.
So that was just too easy. So, okay, and I'm sorry to interrupt. I just truly couldn't resist.
So later that month, I pitched another story that was also shut down. And it was about what vaccine mandates were going to look like at universities in Manitoba. I had a professor lined up, an immunologist lined up from Ontario. They were on a committee there helping to draft the rollout of mandatory vaccines at the University of Guelph and McGill. They talked about students having less freedom on campus, there'd be more security, more policing of students. Those who refused to wear a mask could be hauled off by campus police. I also had an ethicist lined up who was willing to talk about his concerns over mandatory vaccinations for students. And both the experts were saying they were worried about the mental health of students that were going into a second year of restrictions. Both were getting contacted by parents and students who just were not in support of this. And I thought this would be an excellent discussion to have in Manitoba with faculty and parents and students for our audience to hear, because it was already rolling out in Ontario and it was going to be coming into Manitoba. They were ahead of us. And I also said I had spoken with 2 legal firms that were fighting mandatory vaccines on campuses, and they felt the court ruling in Ontario could set a precedent for the rest of the country. There was no response to what I pitched that day. Instead, I was assigned another story about an infestation. This time it was bed bugs and a local housing complex. And no one else had been assigned to that story that I had pitched. So I interpreted that as I was quickly becoming silenced and canceled for trying to get the other side of the story out. I was battle-weary. I was exhausted from fighting. I never felt more alone in my profession. And as a veteran journalist who is usually fearless and outspoken, I no longer felt it was safe to pitch stories that I knew that we should be telling. And I quickly felt that my existence there was becoming null and void. But I wasn't done yet. In September, I decided I'm going to go directly to Toronto to voice my concerns about our editorial direction, and I was going to tell them what I was experiencing. I started sending emails to Brodie Fenlon, CBC's editor-in-chief, and Paul Hambleton, who was the head of journalistic standards. Now, he's no longer with the CBC. He left a month after I did. I shared with them what I had documented about what was happening with my stories, specific details, what was going on in the newsroom in Winnipeg, the language that was being used, how we had created this culture of hate and division feeding people's fears, and why were we so hostile to people who had an opinion that was different from ours. And while I applauded the CBC's initiative of diversity and inclusiveness in hiring people of different cultures and ethnic backgrounds, I said, where is our diversity in thought? Where is that? Again, I was hearing the word anti-vaxxer being used in the newsroom, and this was already a year and a half into the pandemic. We'd failed to create a safe environment for people to speak to us on the record so their voices could be heard. I told them we had violated all our journalistic standards. We'd broken the public trust, and we withheld information the public had a right to know, and we were guilty. I asked to have a conversation with them before I left, and Brodie Fenlon emailed me back. He thanked me for what I sent, said he'd be happy to talk to me, but with the federal election going on, could we schedule a time afterwards in October, and he would invite Paul Hambleton into this discussion as well. I was pleased he was responded. He had responded. At that point, I knew I had my end date. I'd spoken to HR. I knew when I was going to be leaving the CBC. But I had one more story in the queue I wanted to get out. And it was about a woman who was vaccine injured. I had several calls and conversations with people who had contacted me about they had been vaccine injured, they knew someone who had been vaccine injured, or there was a family member. One of them was the mother of a teenage boy who was an elite athlete. He had gotten the shots. He had chest pain. He was told he was going to have to spend his summer lying on a sofa recovering, and he could not do any sports that summer. A woman called me who got her first shot, and she was really sick, and she was anxious because she went for medical help, and she was told that she should still get the second shot, but maybe she should be admitted to hospital to get the second shot in case she had a worse reaction. This, to me, was madness. It was madness. The rest were afraid that they wouldn't be believed because of, the media mantra we were putting there, safe and effective. The way I saw it, we were gaslighting these people. Let's say you have a refugee coming into the country, and they've suffered trauma and they've been through hell. How do we treat them? We treat them with mercy and compassion and kindness. And yet these people who were being injured, we were gaslighting them. One man who had an adverse reaction said to me, it had to be him. It's got to be me. There's got to be something wrong with me because it's safe and effective. So getting back to the woman I did the interview with, she had had an adverse reaction after her first shot in May of 2021. It took me weeks to gain her trust, for her to go on the record. She was 30 years old, she was an avid runner, and she worked with the federal government. She had no previous heart condition. The very next day after getting the shot, May 27th, she had chest pain. Then she said she was short of breath. She felt like she had this huge weight sitting on her chest. The pain got worse. She had trouble breathing. She described it as the feeling like there was thick smoke in her lungs, but she wasn't a smoker. She knew something was really wrong. She went to emergency at St. Boniface Hospital, where she was diagnosed with pericarditis. And that's inflammation of the tissue around the heart. She shared her written medical report with me from the emergency room doctor. Since her shot in May, within the next month, she'd been to emergency 5 more times with increased chest pain. She could no longer run. She was winded from walking up a flight of stairs, and she said she thought that she was dying. And I had interviewed a cardiologist as well who told me if there's damage to heart cells as an adult, they don't regenerate. The damage is permanent. And yet we were running stories saying take a couple of Advil and there shouldn't be any lasting symptoms from heart inflammation. This woman was on anti-inflammatory medication for months. She was battling depression and anxiety because she was no longer the outgoing, active, happy-go-lucky person she used to be. She also told me how difficult it was to get someone to document what happened to her as an adverse reaction. She said the first doctor who diagnosed it was hesitant to put it in writing. Some doctors didn't know how to fill out the form. Finally, a nurse had filed it for her, and that was another story I pitched. The problems with doctors reporting adverse reactions in Canada. They have to download a PDF. Takes about 15 minutes to fill it out. The doctor has to sign it. Then it goes to a health authority who has to approve it. And some of the doctors were telling me that their reports were getting rejected, and I was hearing more and more about the problems with reporting these adverse reactions in Canada. And there was even a period during the pandemic that the line that they used to report these adverse reactions was down. The link wasn't working. Surely this was newsworthy. No interest in that story. But getting back to the woman I interviewed, I stayed in touch with her after doing her own research. She connected with 3 other women who were diagnosed with heart inflammation after being vaccinated. I wrote her story. Here was my first line based on what she told me. This was the original before it was edited. A 30-year-old Winnipeg woman says she's not confident the COVID-19 vaccine is safe for everybody and is advising people to do their research. She admits she was hesitant at first to get the shot, but she felt pressure from people posting online that she was selfish if she didn't. 2 words the editors didn't like in there: vaccine and hesitant. Again, several hands were in this story, several. A managing editor, 2 web writers, another producer, and I fought several edits that were made. But now at this point I was sort of afraid because I thought if I pushed them too hard they could pull the story entirely. Okay, here's the story the CBC published on July 12, 2021. This is my story and this is what they changed. Winnipeg woman shocked by heart lining inflammation after COVID vaccine, but experts say the risk remains low. Look at the first line. A 30-year-old Winnipeg woman says she was shocked to be diagnosed with a condition involving inflammation of the lining around her heart days after she got her COVID-19 vaccination in late May. The changes that they made didn't reflect what she was saying to me about the safety concerns. It was propaganda editing to change the meaning entirely. Any reference to vaccine hesitancy was taken out. I fought the web writer on that first sentence. He says, well, no, we can't say that. We don't want to scare people. I says, that's not journalism. I said, maybe we should be concerned. Look what happened to her. And I said, we can't negate her personal lived experience. Her story is one of caution and to do research. And if you look at the next sentence, which says, but a Winnipeg cardiologist says despite concerns about heart inflammation, vaccines are preventing illness from COVID-19. Why would anyone read any further in my story? Basically, the message was, it happened to her, it's too bad, it's unfortunate, but vaccines are still doing what they're supposed to be doing. But there were medical experts who were disputing this, but they had been counseled by the CBC because according to the CBC, they were spreading disinformation. The fact she was an avid runner was taken out of the story, and I fought to have that put back in. I says, no, I think that's important. You know, she was a runner, and now she can barely walk up the stairs. It shows what happened before and after the shot. And she never got the second one because her reaction was so severe after the first. And I also didn't think there should be experts or stats negating what she was saying, because we'd heard more than enough from all of the experts. It should be just a straight-ahead story about someone who suffered an adverse reaction, and we shouldn't downplay it. Instead, the way I saw it, her story was buried in experts and health officials and stats. It was sanitized. I lost sleep the night before that story was published. I knew we didn't do justice to her story. I spoke with her the next day, and she was so traumatized she couldn't read the story. I should also tell you, I contacted her 5 months after I left the CBC, and she was still suffering from health problems, blood clots. That story was the breaking point for me. I was waiting for that final exit meeting with Fenelon and Hamilton in October. And when I had it, I told them what had happened to my stories, how devastated I was to be leaving the CBC after spending 3 decades in a career that I loved. I asked them, what's the makeup of the CBC Toronto Health Unit? Like, who are these people? Are they journalists? Are they scientists? Like, who are they? I was basically told they were experts who are really good at what they do, but I still don't know who they are. Then I brought up the issue of mandatory training and seminars for journalists that we had to take on what was called conscious and unconscious bias. We had to sign off on this training. It was to identify any bias we may have in doing a story and to be aware of it, to make sure it doesn't impact the story that we're doing and that we are more inclusive. I said, you know what? We, the CBC, have a glaring bias, both conscious and unconscious, when it came to stories involving experts opposing the narrative and with those who were unvaccinated. We had a glaring bias. I said I was worried about the next generation of journalists. They're young, they're inexperienced, and that the editorial meeting is not a safe place to have a different opinion. Why are we so mean and hostile to people with different opinions? And I said, did you know how we were being branded outside the walls, the corporate walls of the CBC? I said, I've seen those protests. I've seen those signs. We were being known as the Canadian Brainwashing Corporation, or in faith circles, the Christian Bashing Corporation. Some of my final words to them, as I saw it, I said the CBC is morally and ethically culpable of the narrative that it pushed to the public, and we are going to be held accountable. We failed to hold power to account, and no one was holding the media to account. We failed to serve the public. We broke their trust. I told them you can silence and cancel scientists with impeccable credentials. You can even cancel me. But I said my solace is that the truth will come out. It will come out. Brody thanked me, and he said he was sorry that it had ended this way and that he didn't think the CBC had done all that bad. He wished me well. Hamilton, who is the head of journalistic standards, he was still on the screen, and he told me that the most heat that he took during COVID was over ivermectin. People calling and writing with letters with no let-up. I said the CBC should have listened on many fronts. The truth will come out. That's what I said in October 2021. So here we are, a year and a half later. The truth has come out. Even though people still do not want to believe the truth. According to Health Canada's own website, up into including March 3rd, a total of 427 deaths were reported following vaccination. 427. Each and every one of those deaths was worthy of a story. Where was the CBC? Where was any media on this? And is that number accurate? The same Health Canada website posted more than 10,000 serious injuries for the same time period. Are those numbers accurate? Are they higher because of all the problems with reporting adverse reactions in Canada? Who are the injured? What are their names? What are their stories? What are they suffering? Lawsuits are going on, and there's a few people of the vaccine injured who are getting settlements. We have one before the courts right now in Manitoba involving a young man from Steinbach. If reporters were doing their jobs, we would not be here today in this forum, funded by citizens, telling our stories. Mainstream media would have done it. Where are they? Where are they? On February 27th of this year, papers with hundreds of profiles of suspected COVID vaccine injuries and deaths were plastered onto the doors and windows of CBC Toronto. I had a really hard time looking at those pictures because that to me was proof and evidence that the public had trusted us and they had listened, and some of them paid dearly for it. I waited to see, is CBC going to cover this? Is any media going to cover this? How could you ignore this? It was just unconscionable and appalling that nobody covered it. I thought, I wonder how employees felt that day when they came to work and they saw those posters on the outside of the building. Did they stop? Did they look? Did they read? Did they look at the names? Or did they just go into the building and carry on with work that day? The same thing happened in Winnipeg on a smaller scale. Again, no media coverage. And as mentioned earlier, CBC decided to pause its Twitter activity after it was labeled government-funded media by Elon Musk. Brodie Fenlon had responded by publishing a piece saying, "Journalistic independence is the cornerstone of who we are as a public broadcaster." Then that tweet was removed. CBC is not impartial. It is not independent. I think what I shared with you gives witness to that. There was some excitement over the fact CBC Manitoba covered the NCI when it stopped in Winnipeg in mid-April. Maybe finally the CBC was going to report the other side. But it was a low-impact piece in that it didn't talk to anyone who was vaccine injured. It didn't delve into any of the Pfizer data. And it didn't talk about safety concerns or side effects.
Can I give you even more shocking information? Can you go back to that slide? So Jay Bhattacharya is on the screen while the CBC is there talking about CBC censoring him. So, and there was no mention about that.
Those stories should have gotten out, and there's so much more that should have gotten out. I mean, basically, it was a story. It was a low ball story in the sense the bar was low. They didn't delve into what they should have dug into there. I don't know if any of you have heard of Naomi Wolf. She's a famous American author and journalist. She posted a video on YouTube last month exposing what is in the Pfizer documents. I think it's something that all critically thinking journalists should have been digging into. The FDA wanted the documents to be hidden for 75 years. A judge said no. So Pfizer was ordered to release 55,000 documents a month. And according to Wolf, around 2,500 experts from all over the world are interpreting this data. They're churning out reports to tell everybody what's in it. And the evidence, in her words, is dark, devastating. one of the many findings is that Pfizer knew the vaccine didn't stop the transmission of COVID 1 month after rollout in November of 2020. But yet public health officials were telling us, were running campaigns to say, get the shot to protect those you love. And the media, including the CBC, was still demonizing the unvaccinated as a danger to public safety. I'm inspired by Wolf and those outside of legacy media who are tenacious and fearless about reporting the truth, and they're truly independent. For me, that would be, on this side of the border, True North, Western Standard, podcast by Trish Wood. I was fortunate that when I left, I was at the end of my career. I still wanted to work for 2 or 3 years, but to leave the way I did was crushing. It was heartbreaking, and it was definitely a journey of grief. I was able to take an early retirement.
And Marianne, I'm going to have to focus you just because we're really running over.
I got 30 seconds.
Okay.
Maybe even less. So my heart goes out to those who are starting out or midway in their careers, and for them the challenge is even more daunting. When I was asked to testify, I said, it's dangerous to tell the truth, but I think it was someone with the Inquirer who said to me, it's even more dangerous to not tell the truth. So getting our institutions back. Will we get the CBC, our public broadcaster, back? I don't know. But I do know that more journalists need to stand up, speak out, and stand firm as a truth teller. Thank you.
And wait, we're good. We have commissioner questions. So, and the commissioners have questions. So,
thank you very much for your testimony. I'm learning on specific story that you illustrated what I have witnesses from the outside. So it's interesting to have this confirmation. I'd like to ask one question, because I'm not a journalist, so I don't know, but when we, I would say, use or abuse the term expert in journals, shouldn't there be some sort of gold standard that, first of all, you cannot cite experts that are faceless, you don't know who they are, and if you cite them, you give their credentials so everybody can judge by themselves what is their expertise. Secondly, you mentioned that in many stories that was produced over the pandemic, it was one-sided, and it was the official narrative, and every time somebody was trying to come up with a different version, another expert, they were either dismissed or denigrated. So about your story that went to be checked in Toronto, wouldn't that be a good idea to say, okay, you're proposing these other experts, I will accept if you agree that this expert has a public debate with the expert I'm citing in my article. What do you think of that idea?
That would be the ideal, but that was not something they were open to. And I think in Mr. Palmer's presentation earlier, in terms of that term expert, it goes back to, like, when they were giving me the names of those two people, do your research. Who are these people? Are they really experts? Are we just designating them experts? And that was a problem that I saw throughout the pandemic. It was very specific about who their experts were going to be, and they were going to be portrayed as competent and trustworthy. But to have a debate, that's something I challenged them on many topics, like ivermectin in terms of experts on both sides, the vaccine injuries, being concerned about safety. I was constantly putting that before them, but it was like I wasn't being heard. So, and that was coming from the highest level of the CBC. To be fair to CBC Manitoba, they cleared the story except for that one web writer, and then it was shut down in Toronto. And I had no power at that point in terms of, I said I think these people should have a say for the sake of fairness and balance, they should be heard. And I even challenged them to publish the story without Toronto's consent, but they wouldn't do that.
So just a complementary question. Was that a common practice in the past to do that sort of confrontation of expert with different view, or is it something that was never practiced in journalism? You would do it like a common way of reporting on different opinion. Would you had to really make sure that when two different views are presented, that they were framed in a way that the reader could actually make their own judgment about it? And now it seems that that's completely disappeared from what we're being exposed to. And I can tell you it's not only CBC, we see the same thing in Quebec with all of the journal, we're seeing the same story.
It just happened to this degree, I would say, during COVID. Before, we would do thorough vetting of people we put on the air as experts and thorough checking of their credentials and what their experience was. And usually we'd even check them out with 2 or 3 other sources if they were legitimate and were they in good standing. But that seemed to have all gone by the wayside.
Thank you very much.
I was going to say good morning, but I realize it's now good afternoon. Thank you for your testimony. When I think of the daily PMO news releases that are sent out every day from the PMO's office, to which CBC journalists would receive, and how religious holidays are identified, recognized, and celebrated, and I should also add, rightly welcomed in a democratic nation that recognizes freedom of religion and beliefs as a fundamental right in this country, and similarly as a foundational principle in our Constitution under the supremacy of God and rule of law, these PMO releases often offer very lengthy and detailed descriptions of respective religious traditions. And then I think back to a comment made by the PMO prior to his first election, Christians need not apply. And then I combine it with a very short PMO release that came out one year. I believe it was 2017 or 2018. I believe it was one paragraph regarding the Christian holiday, the traditional Christmas. 2 things come to mind. It appears CBC is broadcasting the PM's personal opinion publicly, essentially becoming the PM's mouthpiece, but even more so targeting specific faith groups using hatred for these faith groups to which the PM has publicly disagreed. And if this is the case, how can Canadians be confident in a publicly funded broadcaster that deliberately and intentionally ignores entrenched protected grounds under human rights legislation? And 2, should we as Canadians be considering CBC in its current mindset a danger to society for not adhering to their own ideology, that is diverse, inclusive, and equitable treatment of all persons, regardless of their faith and personal beliefs to which they subscribe?
Which part of that do you want me to respond to? That was
Whatever you think you should respond
Well, here's the thing. That was an issue I had brought forward a number of times in CBC about the fact of how do we cover different faith groups. And we even had a working group on that, and we invited a number of people in from different faith communities to, say, what are the stories that you think we should be telling? And for a while there we were doing that. We had a forum, and it was a wonderful forum. We had a rabbi in there, we had Muslim people, we had Catholics, we had evangelicals, we had Mennonites, we had Jewish people in there, and there was a consensus working group on how do we move forward stories based that are faith-based, and we were going in the right direction for a while, and then all of a sudden it just swung the other way where we'd become hostile again, and anyone who express their faith in a story. I mean, I look at all the pastors in Manitoba that stood out during the pandemic and defied rules and said, how can you have 300 people in Costco and you're telling us we can only have 25 people in our church at a service on Sunday? We're not going to stand for this. And they didn't. And, they were hammered by the media for expressing their faith and standing up for it. So there's definitely a hostility towards faith just my experience at the CBC, and I was constantly bringing that to the forefront and trying to do more stories that way. And sometimes I was able to get those stories out, and in some I weren't. I wasn't able to. But clearly, like we made a specific decision here in our coverage during the pandemic to hammer those communities in southern Manitoba that were faith-based, that were pushing back against this narrative in the agenda. And that was so wrong.
Thank you.
I'm from Manitoba, and I mourn the loss of the CBC as a fair and unbiased news reporter. I had personal friends who were on the I-team years ago, and I remember the stories they used to bring out. One of the things that we've heard over and over and over again in the testimony is that prior to 2020, things changed. Words changed. Definition of pandemic changed. Definition of vaccine changed. Definition of human rights changed. A lot of things changed. And my question is usually there's an old expression that a leopard can't change its spots. Was there significant changes in the higher management of the CBC prior to 2020, like in 2018, 19? How did they accomplish this complete change of philosophy without changing the management?
Well, I think the management just bought into it. I think, I look at other stories where the language changes in order to make it acceptable to the public, and that's basically what was being done. The whole thing of the mantra of safe and effective, we didn't even investigate that, and yet the people that were in management, these were people that had worked that I-team you're talking about. So for me, I was shocked and sort of disoriented about why wasn't there any pushback about the language and the words we were choosing to use that were dangerous and misleading.
We heard testimony from many witnesses about how they were treated specifically by the CBC, and didn't the CBC, according to those witness testimony, didn't the CBC go beyond just ignoring certain stories? And we heard testimony after testimony of personal character assassinations carried out by the CBC. Were you aware of any of that? Can you corroborate any of that?
I was aware of that. To give the best example would be Byron Bridle. Look what was done to him. This guy is impeccable credentials, immunologist, and the smear campaign against him was just, it was unconscionable. What was done to his career, it was a character assassination to discredit him for all the safety concerns he was raising. And I raised that with management because I wanted to interview him in a story. And actually, what was interesting is I wanted to interview as well Dr. Christensen in Saskatoon. He was the doctor, Dr. Francis Christian. He was the doctor who stood up and said, I haven't met a 12-year-old yet that understands informed consent. And I wanted to interview him. And I was blocked from doing that as well. It was like, oh no, his reputation, he stood up, he's pushing against the narrative. And I'm thinking that's exactly the people we should be talking to have fairness and balance.
There was also something that you said that I just want to make sure I understood properly. When you were doing one of your original stories and you were quoting the doctors from the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, when comments came back from Toronto, I thought you said one of the comments was, well, some of the members are anonymous there. Is that what you said?
That's right. That's what they said to me.
But then didn't you also tell us that when you asked the Toronto people who the members of the Toronto CBC Health Group was, that you were told they were anonymous?
I wasn't told they were anonymous. I was told they were experts at what they did, but I didn't know if that meant they were journalists or were they scientists. I still don't know who they are, but they were not anonymous. But the reference was the Toronto Health Unit was concerned that some members of the Canadian COVID Care Alliance were anonymous. And I said I didn't think that was an issue because the fellow I interviewed had gone on full face on camera. But the reason for their anonymity, they were concerned, like, what did that mean? And I said maybe it meant that the fact that they're trying to continue in their practice without being disciplined. But for them, that was an issue.
But they were.
But it was unrelated to the
Commissioners,
story.
Can I just break in for a second? Because we've got a couple of hard starts that I just need to inform you of. We have a person online that, basically if we don't start immediately, should be a short witness.
Okay.
And then I was hoping, then we have a shorter lunch break to hit another hard start. We could bring Marianne back, like we had done with Rodney, for questions at the end of the day.
It's not necessary.
So, okay. So, yeah, and I'm sorry to cut that short, Marianne. It's just we're trying to manage some other witnesses too.
Thank
so
you.
on behalf of the National Citizens Inquiry, I sincerely thank you for coming and attending. I know that it was a big step, but we really appreciate you sharing with us some insight that we couldn't get unless you came and shared with us. So deeply thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you.